The silence in the cold stone chambers weighed heavy, a lingering chill seeping deep beneath your threadbare motley, as dawn sipped pale blue through narrow windows. You awoke, throat still parched, from yesterday's stale bread smeared thin with sour cheese, the king's breakfast that never bothered to become a feast. The faint scent of damp stone, mingled with stale ale, hung stubbornly in the air, stubborn as the day ahead. Your fingers brushed the rough wool of your costume, itchy and uneven, reminding you that your role was far from glamorous. Outside, the castle seemed a breathing beast. Distant footfalls echoed on flagstones, mingling with the scrape of a wooden bucket and the intermittent clucks of restless fowl. The cold seeped in as much as the stone walls did, sharp and unforgiving, as if the very air conspired to sap your spirit. If you think a modern dead phone battery is a nuisance, imagine how it felt watching your last ember of fire flare out in a sprawling medieval hall, where warmth wasn't a room, but a momentary blessing. Today, like every day, you shuffled toward your rattling bells, the familiar clink-clank sounding like a fragile heartbeat in the stillness. You caught a glimpse of yourself in a polished helmet left on a side table. A faded smile painted on your lips felt heavier than the jester's cap perched crookedly on your head. The laughter you stirred might fill halls, but it often felt hollow, echoing off walls, as empty as the promises of favor you once imagined. Yet a faint shimmer of warmth came as you passed. A hearth where stable boys gathered, sharing grudging smiles over a meager fire, sparks floating lazily up the chimney shaft. For a fleeting pulse, a flicker of belonging sparked within you. But then, the hallways fell still, unnaturally so. The usual chorus of barking dogs, ever present like a background melody, ceased abruptly. Even the caw of ravens paused, as if the castle itself held its breath. From the corner of your eye, you caught a subtle exchange. A pair of nobles whispering behind veiled hands, their eyes flickering with something unreadable, heavy with intention. Something unspoken hung in the frosty air, sharper than the bite of dawn. And just as you grasped for meaning in the murmurs, the heavy oak door at the end of the corridor creaked open slowly, admitting not light, but a shadow long overdue. Hey, before Morpheus takes you fully, do a quick check if you're still subscribed. For some, the button vanished, and I wouldn't want you to miss out on the next sleepy stories. Grab a soft like, as gentle as a pillow. Tell me below, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Your little nudge keeps this quiet corner alive. Thanks for being part of it. The shadow slipped through the doorway, swallowing the faint light like a raven's wing in a fogged-out dawn. You barely breathed as it stretched across the cold flagstones, a dark pulse that seemed to absorb the very sound from the hall. The whispered words you caught earlier, the weight behind those veiled glances, tightened like a noose of unseen warning. Your fingers, instinctively went to the bells, their clink-clank now feeling hollow, a fragile heartbeat that might shatter at any moment. The nobles' murmurs stopped abruptly as their eyes darted to the shadow. The servants, so used to the castle's usual symphony of noises, stood silent as statues. Even the flicker of the hearth seemed to slacken, the dancing flames shivering in retreat as if sensing the chill of what had just entered. You swallowed, throat tighter than before. The stale bread and sour cheese of yesterday's meager meal gnawed at your insides again. Hunger wasn't simply a physical ache here. It was the creeping frost that bit at hope itself. A draft whispered across the corridor, carrying that stubborn scent of damp stone mixed with something new and strange, metal, cold and sharp, like a blade just freed from the scabbard. The jester's cap perched crookedly on your head suddenly felt heavier, as if the very weight of the day pressed down more firmly on your bowed shoulders. Your painted smile flickered, fragile as the last spark of a dying fire in a vast, empty hall. You prized your laughter, but now it felt lost, scraped off the stones and washed away in a restless tide of silence. From the corner of your eye, a stable boy shuffled past, his eyes wide, flicking nervously toward the shadow. His soot-streaked face, usually so indifferent to the court's secrets, now bore the raw stitch of fear. The crackling fire beside him struggled against the cold air, bleeding through the castle's bones. A spark floated upward, trailing smoke like a ghost's breath, before disappearing into the chimney's black throat. Stepping cautiously forward, your boots rasped softly against the stone, startling no one into movement. The castle's breathing, once a rhythm of life, felt erratic now, as though the ancient fortress held its breath, waiting. You could hear, faint beneath the silence, the almost imperceptible rustle of silk and velvet as the nobles gathered behind tapestries, their eyes narrowed, watching the shadow with a mix of dread and excitement tangled in their veiled whispers. The shadow stretched into a figure, tall, cloaked in the heavy folds of midnight. A hood hid the face, but you caught the glint of something cruelly familiar, a flicker of recognition that set your nerves jangling. Not a man, not quite, something other, a flicker of stories best left untold. The flickering torchlight caught steel at the figure's side, the blade's edge biting into shadow itself. Your heart thudded a stammering rhythm. You'd learn too late that the castle's walls held more than echoes. Secrets lived here, breathing beneath stone and mortar, and some were hungry. The nobles edged back, their murmurs crescendoing into urgent hushes. The shadow moved with deliberate patience, a predator in a room full of trembling prey. The air dipped colder, sapping warmth like an invisible winter that didn't belong to the season. A sudden creak shattered the quiet, the ancient floorboard groaning under unseen weight. You turned sharply, breath catching, not from fear exactly, but the cold gaze of inevitability pressing in like the castle itself, closing ranks. Behind the cloaked figure, a servant stumbled, barely stifling a gasp. Eyes wide, trembling, the man's fingers gripped a crumpled letter, its edges stained with something dark and sticky. You glanced quickly around. The others avoided the servant's gaze, faces tight and pale. The letter was no casual note. It was a harbinger. A blade slipped through the cracks of whispered conspiracies. The stable boy's gaze flicked to it, then to you, a silent question. What now? Your hand tightened on the bells. The familiar weight was suddenly a lifeline tethered to a sinking ship. If the castle had secrets, maybe laughter, hollow as it seemed, was the only defiant light left. The cloaked figure spoke, voice low, carrying the steel promise of command. The words sliced through the hall like a blade, cold and sharp. The dawn has come, but shadows will claim the day. You felt the shift before you heard it, the silent exchange of power passing unseen between noble hands. The castle's breath caught, suspended between what was said and what was left unsaid. For a heartbeat, the hall seemed to tilt, a precarious balance, ready to tip. Then, a sudden movement. Curtains swayed as a cold wind snuck through a cracked window, whisking the letter from the servant's trembling grasp. It fluttered like a dying moth and came to rest at your feet. You knelt, fingers trembling, as you unfolded the parchment. The ink was smeared, some letters illegible, but the message was clear enough to pierce the cold fog settling in your mind. Warnings of betrayal, of unseen enemies within these stony walls, and a fate far darker than forgotten jokes or stale breakfasts. The flagstones beneath you felt suddenly colder, crunching beneath your weight like brittle bones awaiting burial. The laughter you'd worn like armor now seemed a fragile shell cracking under the castle's looming shadow. Outside, the first light brightened, a pale conqueror pushing relentlessly against the dark. Yet inside, where stone and silence reign, you knew the day carried with it a secret better left buried. And as you rose, the bells hung silent in your hand, forgotten for now. The silence crept back in, thicker, waiting. You glanced once more at the figure enveloped in shadow, their eyes hidden but their purpose clear. The day was far from over, and the castle's long, dark game was just beginning. The letter at your feet crinkles under your trembling fingers like a fragile wing, its edges frayed and ink smeared by hurried hands. An urgent plea, scrawled in haste, yet heavy with the weight of betrayal. You barely dare to breathe as your eyes scan the faint words, catching fragments as elusive as whispers carried through draughty corridors. Treachery, shadowed alliances, and a danger rooted not in swords or siege, but in the poison of whispered conspiracies. Behind you, the cloaked figure looms, a sentinel of silence amid the frost-bitten air, as if the very darkness has taken form and come to claim the hall. A noble's veiled glances slice through the tension like sharpened blades. Some stage for your jester's farce has transformed into a cage of secrets, and the laughter you once conjured seems now a brittle echo, fading beneath the weight of nameless fears. The faint crackling of the hearth pulls your gaze again. The fire sputters, wrestling against the encroaching cold that clings to every corner. Its orange glow paints trembling shadows on stone walls etched with the history of countless silent betrayals. You wonder, not for the first time, if that fire might pale before the coming dusk. Footsteps ripple through the hall, soft but deliberate. Another figure emerges from the darkened passage, a woman draped in silks dark as midnight, her eyes sharp, glinting with a cold fire that seems to pierce through shadow itself. She pauses just short of where the letter lies, her gaze flickering between it. And the cloaked stranger, the castle breathes around you, its ancient bones creaking as if settling in for a storm. The nobles quickly form a semicircle, their whispers melting into uneasy silence. Neither ally nor enemy stands fully revealed, but the threads of distrust tighten around every word unspoken. Your fingers clutch the bells at your side, their familiar weight suddenly foreign, an awkward reminder that, amid this fragile dance of power, your laughter is a forgotten weapon, one too brittle to sway whispered deals and the cold steel of intentions hidden beneath velvet cloaks. You catch a glimpse of the stable boy again, his face hardened now, teeth clenched against the gnawing fear that his innocence can no longer shield. He steps closer, almost imperceptibly, his eyes silently urging caution. You nod, a silent truce. In a castle roaring with unseen dangers, the woman kneels slowly, her voice low, threading through the stillness. These words, they trace the shape of a blade aimed at the king's heart. If this is true, the shadows gather not only in the corridors, but in the throne room itself. A ripple of gasps, stifled quickly, follows her statement. The noble's eyes dart like restless birds, calculating, weighing. The cloaked figure shifts, a glint of steel, catching the soft torchlight, a silent reminder that words alone are not the only weapons in play. A sudden chill snakes through the hall, sharper than before, as if the castle itself recoils from the revelation. The letter trembles in your hand, heavy with the fate of a kingdom poised on the edge of a blade. You glance towards the doorway, the source of that ominous shadow. No hint of its bearer's face, only that unyielding, suffocating silence. The figure moved like a predator stalking prey, patient and inexorable. Despite your years within these stone walls, a primal dread coils in your gut, whispering of dooms best not named. From the distant corridors comes a faint clatter, a herald of movement beyond the chamber. The nobles stiffen, a messenger perhaps, or an assassin's herald. Unseen tensions crack through the halls tonight, yet amidst the gathering shadow, a stray glimmer catches your eye. The fire, the flicker stubbornly refusing to falter, casts a fleeting golden hue upon the letter's edges, an ember of hope in a rising storm, a reminder that even in stone and silence, small defiance persists. The woman stands, her gaze locking with yours for a heartbeat. We must act before the dawn does not find us whole. The king's enemies walk in daylight, cloaked in smiles and empty promises. A sudden sharp scrape interrupts the moment. The letter, as though stirred by unseen fingers, twitches and flutters again at your feet. You bend forward, the weight of fate pressing down. And then, a jot of movement. From behind a tapestry, a pale hand shoots out, fingers snapping inches from the letter before. Retracting hastily, too quick for you to catch, but enough to fray nerves taut as drawn bowstrings. The hall swells with a tension invisible, yet nearly audible, a breath held too long underwater. The nobles exchange quick glances, the silent calculus of danger and loyalty, playing out in their measured expressions. You clutch the bells tightly. They might be fragile, but tonight they are the pulse beating against the creeping dark. Outside, the first rays of a stubborn dawn tease the horizon, pale and hesitant. But inside these ancient walls, as the shadow stretches long and cold, one truth rises sharper than any blade. Some secrets refuse the light, and some shadows are hungry for more than just silence. The door at the far end groans open again. This time, it's not just one shadow crossing the threshold, but many. Silent figures, their faces masked, moving with a purpose that chills every stone in the castle to its core. The masked figures moved with quiet purpose, their footsteps a slow drumbeat against the cold flagstones, measured, deliberate, as if they bore the weight of the castle's very fate. The flickering torchlight struggled to reach the farthest corners, where these shadows gathered, black shapes melding seamlessly into the dark recesses. Your eyes darted nervously between the cloaked stranger and this new silent procession, each breath coming shallow and tight. You could feel the chill deepening, not just from the stone underfoot, but from an intangible frost settling over the hall, a cold that gnawed past flesh and bone and ate at resolve. The fire's orange glow sputtered weakly, its light a frail sentry against encroaching gloom, casting twisted silhouettes that danced reluctantly on the damp walls. The nobles, once aloof and practiced in their courtly masks, now pressed together like trapped birds, their whispered calculations faltering under the weight of this gathering dread. The thick silence swallowed everything, the usual rustle of silk, the distant clatter of cups, even the faint scent of roasting meat seemed to vanish, replaced by something metallic and sharp lurking on the air. From where you stood, clutching the bells like a battered lifeline, The scene felt like a stage set for calamity, a play penned in shadows, scripted by secrets. One of the masked figures stepped forward, pausing just beneath the flickering torchlight. The hood slid back to reveal a pale face, marked by cold eyes. Eyes that held the sheen of ruthless calculation, sharp as the blade sheathed at the figure's side. Her lips parted, voice low and steady, cutting through the silence like a knife. The king's enemies walk among us. Today, masks will be ripped away. The room seemed to shudder at her words, the air itself contracting with silent threat. You swallowed hard, the stale taste of yesterday's meager meal surfacing again. Each breath a reminder of hunger, not just for food, but for truth. Behind her, another figure produced a folded strip of parchment, crisp, precise, the edges freshly inked. The woman's hands unfolded it carefully, exposing a map marked with faint sigils and notes in hurried script. Names, dates, places, all adrift in a swirl of conspiracies that threaten to undo the fragile tapestry holding this kingdom together. You stepped closer, drawn, despite a growing knot of warning twisting in your gut. The map's lines were sharp, a metallic tang almost burning your eyes as you traced the routes. Secret paths, hidden meetings, betrayals whispered in the dead of night. The nobles leaned in, eyes flickering from the map to the woman's steady gaze. The tapestry behind them fluttered slightly, stirred by a breath of cold wind slipping through a cracked window. It seemed as if the castle itself were breathing, the ancient stone alive with murmurs of unrest. Your fingers grazed the bells, their metallic clink a fragile heartbeat amid the growing storm. You had worn their weight like armor. Now they felt like the last shard of light in a gathering night. "Who brings this?" A voice broke through the tension, a tall lord whose eyes gleamed with suspicion and fear. "How do we know this is not poison in written form?" The woman's lips curved in a thin, knowing smile. "Because it speaks truth no man dares utter aloud. Because the hand that wrote this did not seek favor, only warning." A ripple of incredulous murmurs stirred the circle. Eyes darted, sharp as hawks, measuring friend from foe. The figures at the periphery, once mere shadows, now took on shape, silent sentries as much as participants. Their presence a reminder that silence had allies. You caught the stable boy's gaze again. The innocence that had once gleamed in his eyes was tempered now, strands of fear and resolve woven into a cautious wariness. He glanced at you, lips barely moving. "What will you do?" You exhaled slowly, the cool breath mingling with the musty air. Your painted smile, so often a mask for the unseen pain, felt fragile, yet defiant. If laughter no longer lit the halls, perhaps knowledge, this shard of truth, could kindle a spark. The woman rolled the map carefully and tucked it beneath her cloak. "We cannot linger. The king's court festers with vipers. The dawn promises nothing but more deception." At that moment, a sudden clatter from the far corridor shattered the fragile suspense. A young page stumbled into the hall, face pale, breath ragged, a raven's black cloak trailing behind, suggesting urgency, perhaps danger. His eyes found the woman's first, then the noble's. "Your Highness," he gasped, voice barely above a whisper. "The Northern Watch reports movement. Armored men approaching under the guise of traitors." The hall exhaled a collective tension. Pulse quickening like a trapped beast. The castle's breath, once erratic, steadied into a sharp rhythm of impending clash. You stepped back, the bells now a cold, inert weight in your palm, as the walls themselves seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. Moments stretched thin, every heartbeat a drum signaling the fragile line between order and chaos. Outside, the reluctant dawn thickened into pale light, brushing the horizon with tentative hope. But inside, stone and shadow marked a different kind of day, one where loyalty was a blade and trust a fleeting spark, snuffed by the breath of secrets. And then, just as all seemed poised on the edge, the cloaked woman's gaze snapped to the door, a sudden, swift flicker, and you turned in time to see a narrow blade shimmering briefly before plunging into shadow, leaving behind a silence darker and deeper than any before. The game had begun. The sudden, sharp gleam of steel vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by shadows that clung like cobwebs to every corner of the hall. Your breath hitched, lungs tightening as the remnants of silence stretched longer than comfort allowed. The castle's cold bones seemed to contract beneath the weight of what just unfolded, a silent fracture, tearing through the fragile calm. The pale woman's eyes blazed with an intensity that turned the air brittle. She stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the suffocating stillness like wind through dead leaves. The knife was not a warning. It was the opening note of a dirge. Around you, the nobles stiffened, their finely embroidered cloaks whispering against one another, a rustling web of secrets tightening its grip. The map still tucked beneath the woman's cloak, pressed against her side, an unyielding symbol of the dark designs twisting beneath the throne. Your fingers clenched the bells so tightly the metal bit into your palm, their cold weight anchoring you amidst the storm. Laughter was no longer your shield here. Instead, vigilance was the coin you paid to stay alive. A distant rumble echoed through the stone corridors, a tremor, or perhaps the heavy footsteps of fate itself. The page who'd rushed in still trembled, eyes wide with haste. "The Northern Watch confirms," he gasped. "But these men, they wear no heraldry. Traitors, yes, but with blood on their hands." His words crawled like ice down your spine. Heat fled the hall. The feeble fire tried to stand, but its glow flickered weakly, as if the flame itself feared the gathering shadows. The murmurs from the noble cluster shifted into hurried exchange, eyes darting from face to face, searching for anchors in a sea of deceit. The cloaked figure who first arrived remained near the door, a sentinel carved from midnight silk. Her presence, a pulse of quiet menace. Her gaze swept the room as though stripping away pretense and peeling back every mask. You caught the stable boy's anxious glance again, younger than you, perhaps not yet corroded by these walls' poisonous breath. His lips parted in silent question, but here, in this web of whispered deaths, there were no easy answers. The woman stepped toward the center, her silhouette cutting a sharp line between solemnity and fiery resolve. "If we wait for daylight, we become prey," she murmured. "Our enemies walk as we do, their smiles carved from the same stone as the king's." A sudden noise sliced the tension, a soft crash followed by the hurried scuffle of feet retreating. Every head snapped toward a tapestry that fluttered slightly, stirred by an unseen breath. For a moment, even the shadows seemed to shudder. You bent to steady yourself, or perhaps to shield your thoughts, and caught a glimpse of something thin and pale disappearing behind the heavy fabric. A snatch of silence followed, deep as the abyss, swallowing your heartbeat whole. The woman's eyes found yours. "Trust is a poison in this hall," she said, voice low and trembling with equal parts warning and plea. "But knowledge is our blade. Hold fast." Her words bore down on you, a tolling bell in a hall growing ever darker. A shiver coursed down your spine, not from cold, but from the rising sense of inevitability, pressed hard against your ribs. This castle, your once stage, was no longer a place of hollow jests or forgotten merriment. It was the theater of a silent reckoning, where every whispered secret might tip the scales. You looked down at the cracked stone floor, the sharp angles and deep grooves rendered more menacing by the failing light. The iron clasps on your bells seemed to pulse faintly, a rhythm barely heard, but insistently steady. You squeezed them once more. The sound was fleeting, a tinny heartbeat, frail against the dark. A sudden beckoning came from the far doorway, a creeping chill, colder now, as though the shadows themselves had gathered will and motion. Silhouettes emerged, moving slow and sure like the tide's rise, a flood erasing the boundaries between friend and foe. The tall woman with the map drew her cloak tighter, her eyes narrowing. "They come with the night's blessing," she whispered, voice seizing the fragile thread between despair and defiance. You took a step back, boots scraping against stone, the faint tremor in your fingers betraying the calm you tried to wear. The laughter you'd carried so faithfully felt like a fading echo, a dim star swallowed by a gathering storm. Outside, the dawn still fought to push its way through the mist, a pale and stubborn rebel refusing to yield to shadow. But deep within these ancient walls, the game had changed. The stage no longer held the same script, and you, the reluctant player, felt the weight of a story turning darker, sharper, untamed. Then, from the silent gallery, where forgotten portraits stared with ghostly eyes, A soft rustle, like silk sliding over stone, alerted you once again. Your gaze flickered to a narrow slit of light, seeping beneath the heavy door at the hall's end. And before you could blink, a voice, low, hard as flint, cut through the thick stillness. The hour has come. Choose your side. The cold air seemed to freeze in place, hanging heavier than ever before. Your heart thudded, louder, its beat a fragile pulse defying the encroaching silence. Outside, the fragile dawn faltered. Inside, the castle whispered a secret hungry for blood. The flickering torchlight cast long, quivering shadows across the stones, painting the chamber in strokes of uncertain amber. A hesitant glow in a hall steeped in gathering menace. Your breath drew shallow and quick, each inhale a thread of cold air that piqued the raw edge of unease, coiling tighter beneath your ribs. The cloaked woman's words still hung heavy, mingling with the scent of smoldering wood and ancient dust, thickening the air like a fog you could almost taste. You tightened your grip on the bells. Their metallic chill pressed against your palm, as if reminding you of a fleeting reason to hold on. This weight, once a jester's ornament, now felt like the last tether grounding you between crumbling allegiances and ascending shadows. Near the hearth, the embers sighed and whispered, a fragile pulse struggling against the cold breath that seeped through cracks in the stone. In that dim flicker, the walls seemed to breathe, an ancient exhale, carrying secrets and silent warnings. You caught the stable boy's guarded glance again, his usual innocence tempered by a new, brittle cautiousness. He stood closer now, his presence a silent anchor amid the swirling currents of dread. Across the chamber, the masked figures shifted like restless ghosts. Their movements were slow, measured, deliberate. One of them stepped forward with the grace of a predator concealed beneath silk. A pale face framed by a cascade of raven hair, eyes sharp as winter frost. Her gaze swept quickly over the gathered nobles, then landed on you with unsettling clarity, as if weighing your soul through the jester's faded smile. Trust is scarce in these halls, she murmured, voice cold and clear. But what we face transcends loyalties, masks, and old grievances. The blade is no longer hidden, only poorly veiled. A ripple of murmurs swept through the nobles, tightened with unspoken fears and fragile schemes. You watched the letter, still clenched in the woman's hand, its creased edges whispering of betrayals written in haste. Your eyes flicked to the crumpled parchment, then tentatively downward, fingers itching to clutch the fragile seal of truth hidden in its faded ink. A door groaned in the distance, a slow, mournful sound that rolled down the stone corridors like a dirge. The castle held its breath. The shadows drew tighter, folding themselves into the folds of velvet and steel. The dons and dames holding their breath behind silk masks. Even the stubborn flames shrank back, painting trembling ghosts on ancestral portraits, whose eyes seemed to watch with quiet accusation. You took a tentative step forward, boots scraping softly on the cold stone, each footfall a muted plea against silence. The air sank colder around you, sharp as a splinter pressed beneath skin, carrying that peculiar scent of iron and wet earth, as if the walls themselves had bled overnight. The masked woman's gaze didn't waver. She folded the letter carefully, slipping it beneath her cloak like a dagger sheathed and ready. "A storm is coming," she said softly. "And it wears the face of those we once called kin." Behind her, a subtle shuffle caught your ear, a breath too deliberate to be mere happenstance. You turned just in time to see a narrow figure retreating behind a tapestry, fingers clutching something hidden. The flicker of movement was too swift to follow, but enough to sharpen the sharp edges of your unease. A whispered rustle ran through the hall, like a frayed thread unraveling. The nobles shifted uneasily, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The castle no longer felt like the fortress of faded tales and hollow laughter you had known. It was a living thing now, a beast poised to strike. Your hand tightened on the bells, the hard metal biting into your skin. They were fragile, yes, hollow relics of merriment amidst this woven web of conspiracy. But for now, they were the pulse in your palm, the heartbeat daring to defy the creeping void. Suddenly, the distant clatter of armor echoed sharply down the hall, a tattoo of steel on stone that quickened the pulse of the room. The tall lord who had spoken earlier stiffened, eyes narrowing too. Slits as urgent words slipped between clenched teeth. Armed men approach. His voice was low, hard as flint. Their banners hidden, their intent as dark as the night. The pall of fear deepened. You felt your throat tighten again. The stale taste of yesterday's stale bread revisiting like an echo of decay. Hunger gnawed deeper than flesh, feasting on hope like ravenous wolves. Outside, the light of dawn hesitated, pale fingers brushing the horizon with fragile insistence, a delicate promise fraying against the oncoming night. Inside, the castle throbbed with tension, alive with whispered breaths and unspoken threats, thickening the cold air. The woman's eyes flashed suddenly, sharp and commanding. "We do not have until the morning. Tonight, the shadows move not only among us, but against us. Choose your allies carefully, or be consumed." Your heart thundered in your chest, the bells in your hand singing faintly, a tentative echo of courage or madness. The jester's mask, perched askew upon your head, felt heavier than ever, the painted smile a fragile shield, cracked beneath the weight of inevitability. Then, as if summoned from the very depths of the stone walls, a soft creak rippled through the room. The heavy oak door at the end of the corridor inched open once more. This time, the darkness poured forward unrestrained, a tide of figures emerging like wraiths from a forgotten dream. Faces hidden behind masks as cold and impenetrable as death itself. And amid the gathering storm of shadows, you heard the faintest, sharpest whisper, just before the world tilted on its axis. Tonight, the game begins anew, and the first move is yours. The heavy oak door groaned once again, sliding open just enough to spill a jagged slice of dawn into the hall. But it wasn't the soft light that drew your eye. From that slender crack, the silhouettes emerged, figures cloaked not only in black fabric, but in secrets darker than the deepest night. The air shifted sharply, cold and urgent, as though the castle itself inhaled, bracing for the storm to break. Your grip tightened on the bells, their metallic chill grounding you against rising tides of dread. The familiar clink seemed to pulse faintly in your palm, a fragile heartbeat locked in place amid the gathering shadows. Slow, reverent footsteps echoed, carrying with them a tension so thick it pressed against your skin like damp cloth. These were no ordinary intruders. Their movements were deliberate, predatory, as if the stones beneath them whispered warnings only they could hear. The pale woman with the map stepped beside you, her sharp eyes sweeping the room, watching how the nobles shifted uneasily. Faces once flushed with the comfortable arrogance of power now paled beneath the weight of impending reckoning. Whispers faded to uneasy silence, swallowed whole by the unyielding presence of these silent specters. One masked figure stepped fully into the flickering torchlight, revealing a face set like carved ivory, cold eyes glinting with the faintest hint of relentless resolve. A knife hung from her waist, its hilt worn but carefully tended, glinting in the fire's faltering glow like a promise sharpened on stone. The time to hide behind masks has ended. Her voice sliced through the stillness, steady though low, resonant with authority. The court's deceptions unravel tonight. A ripple passed through the nobles, some clutching their cloaks tighter, others exchanging glances fraught with calculation. You felt a pull, a strange urgency coiling in your gut, a twisting tension between survival and surrender. The castle's ancient walls seemed to lean closer, eavesdropping on whispered destinies being spun anew. Behind you, the stable boy's eyes locked with yours again, wide but steady now. No longer the innocent observer, he was a silent sentinel amid the chaos. You gave him a small, steadying nod. Together you were fragments caught in the same relentless tide. The torch flames flickered once more, casting angular shadows that danced wildly against the cold stone, as though the very walls rehearsed their role in the night's unfolding drama. The air tasted metallic, sharp, like the edge of freshly drawn steel, and beneath it all, the subtle undertone of old ashes and forgotten promises lingered, unwilling to fade. Suddenly, the heavy door at the far end creaked again, this time pushed wide open by unseen hands. A hush fell, complete and absolute. Even the flickering flames seemed to pause, their light pooled tight as if bracing against what came next. New figures spilled into the room, their faces obscured behind masks that caught no light, reflecting nothing but the chill. The procession was unbroken, a wave swelling behind the first arrival, a silent, suffocating flood. You studied their steps, measured, synchronized, belonging to those who had practiced this dance many times before. The castle held its breath, creaking softly under invisible weight. The pale woman tightened, her grip on the rolled map at her side, her eyes narrowing to sharp slits. Her voice was a mere whisper now, but carried steel beneath its softness. We stand at the edge. Step forward, and the fall is certain. Yet to stand still is to be swallowed. Your mind raced, the monotony of Jess stripped away, revealing raw nerves beneath. The bells in your hand suddenly felt like weighty anchors, strange weapons against unseen darkness. From the back of the hall, a sharp crack echoed. A fragment of wood snapped sharply, echoing like a gunshot in the tense air. Heads whipped around toward the sound as a young page stumbled in, breath ragged and eyes wild. "Your Highness," he gasped, voice breaking the heavy silence like glass. "The northern towers report." Men approach. No banners, no heraldry, only intent. A collective shiver wove through the assembly. The fire, already struggling, flickered uncertainly as if sensing the stealing of life's warmth. The air conspired in silence, thickening intent into a palpable force, pressing into the room's very bones. The pale woman took a decisive step forward, voice steady, despite a flicker of urgency lurking beneath. Tonight, the castle's play is no longer one of shadows and whispers, but of blades and bloodlines. The question is, who will wield the next stroke? The noble lords and ladies exchanged glances sharpened by suspicion and dread, their carefully constructed facades cracking under the weight of possibility. The delicate balance of trust and fear teetered like a candle flame in an unseen draught. You swallowed hard, nostrils flaring, as the scent of damp stone mingled with the faint undertone of cold metal and burning wood. The laughter you once summoned now felt a ghost's echo, fragile and distant against the concrete roar of inevitability. Behind you, the stable boy tightened his jaw, eyes gleaming with the brittle light of resolve. You wondered if fate had ever seemed so sharp, so merciless. A sudden movement caught your attention. From the shadows near a tapestry, a pale hand flicked out, grasping something hidden and pulling it back swiftly. A ghost of intention brushed past, unseen. Your heart thundered an uneven rhythm, each beat a gong, announcing the delicate fracture of alliances. In the widening silence, the woman's gaze fixed on yours, steel meeting faint embers of defiant courage. "It begins," she breathed, "and the choice is no longer survival, but what you're willing to become." Outside, the dawn's pale fingers recoiled as though reluctant to bear witness. Within the chamber, as the walls seemed to constrict and sigh, you knew this was no longer mere theater. The game had turned, and the next move would be yours. The heavy oak door remained ajar, its slow creak a reluctant confession amid the thick silence pressing into the hall. The masked figures, shadows given shape, stood like statues carved from the night itself, silent, yet charged with restless menace. You felt the weight of their gaze, invisible but unyielding, a cold tide creeping against your skin. Your hands tightened involuntarily around the bells, the familiar chill, a thin tether to a forgotten role, the jester who once filled these halls. With laughter that now seemed as fragile as frost on cracked stone. A breath escaped, sharp and shallow, as the woman with raven black hair stepped forward, her eyes sharp blades cutting through the tension. The map she bore was tucked close to her heart, folded like a secret too precious and dangerous to reveal. The murmurs among the nobles melted into a taut silence as their eyes flicked between the shadowed figures and the parchment that spoke of threats unseen. Faces pale and masks rigid, the courtiers seemed less like rulers and more like prey caught in an invisible snare. Each measured breath echoed against the cold stones, carving invisible marks in the gathering gloom. The stable boy shifted closer, his gaze locked on yours. No words, only a shared understanding forged in. The quiet dread that wrapped the room. His soot-streaked face bore a hardness now, the innocence stripped away by the harsh breath of revelation. Together, you stood fragile against the mounting storm inside these ancient walls. The woman's voice broke the hush, low and deliberate, threading steel through every syllable. Night gathers its strength here, and daylight will not be our salvation. The king's enemies are no longer hidden behind masks. They wear smiles as sharp as daggers. A faint rustling whispered from behind a heavy tapestry, the subtle breath of movement that sent a ripple through the assembly. You turned just in time to catch the fleeting glimpse of a pale hand, pulling back swiftly, as if snatching at shadows before they could take form. The castle's silence deepened, swallowing the moment whole. Outside, the dawn struggled against the shifting mist, a fragile glow fighting to claim the horizon. But inside, the shadows drew long and cold, wrapping the chamber in an embrace weighted with secrets and whispered threats. The sharp scrape of boots on stone startled the gathering. A servant, his face pale, breath ragged, appeared at the edge of the circle. His eyes darted nervously as he delivered the weighty news, with a voice barely above a whisper. "Your Highness, the Northern Watch reports movement. Armored men approach the gates. No banners, no heraldry, only intent coated in cold steel." A shudder passed through the room. The fire sputtered as if startled awake from a restless slumber. The scented smoke curled in hesitant spirals, carrying the sharp tang of iron and earth, a reminder that danger clung, not only to the air, but to the stones themselves. The pale woman's gaze narrowed. She drew the map from beneath her cloak, its surface a labyrinth of lines and sigils that traced the veins of betrayal, coursing through the kingdom. Her finger swept across a hidden root, a whisper of conspiracies stitched into the very fabric of the realm. "Tonight," she said, voice barely audible, but fierce with resolve, "the game ceases to be played in shadows. It moves into the light, and we must decide who wields the next move." The nobles exchanged glances sharpened by suspicion. Masks slipped, revealing quick flashes of fear and greed, in eyes too accustomed to courtly deceit. The castle seemed to hold itself together by brittle threads, the ancient stones poised on a precipice. Your bells clinked faintly in your palm, a fragile heartbeat in the mounting darkness. The laughter you once summoned felt lost beneath the cold weight of inevitability, swallowed by the steady encroaching silence. Suddenly, a low murmur stirred the chamber. The masked figures exchanged subtle glances, their presence a suffocating tide pressing against the fragile order. The woman's eyes locked on yours, a silent plea tossed into the tempest. "We stand on the edge. One falter, one misstep, and this fortress will fall not with a battle cry, but with silent whispers." Your breath caught as the heavy door at the far end creaked once more, pushed open further by unseen hands. A flood of figures spilled into the hall, masked, resolute, their movements synchronized, as if rehearsed in countless clandestine encounters. The torchlight caught glimmers of steel beneath cloaks heavy with meaning. They moved like the coming storm, silent but devastating. A shiver raced down your spine. The room's air grew dense, almost viscous, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The faintest scent of smoke mixed with something colder, the coppery tang of blood yet to be spilled. The woman's voice dropped to a whisper, almost lost beneath the hush. "The dawn will bring no salvation. Tonight the castle chooses its fate, and you must choose your side." Your eyes met the steady gaze behind the mask of the pale leader, a silent challenge burning in her cold, unyielding stare. The stakes spun like a tightened thread, taut, ready to snap. Outside, the horizon blushed faintly with the first true light of daybreak. Yet here, inside this chamber cloaked in secrets and steel, darkness held its unyielding dominion. And as the heavy door whispered shut behind the flood of masked figures, your hand tightened on the bells once more. Their fragile clink was not just a heartbeat, it was a summons. The game was no longer waiting, it had begun. The heavy oak door thudded shut behind the tide of masked figures, sealing the chamber in a hush so thick it seemed the stones themselves held their breath. You stood still, the bells cool and quiet in your hand, their faint metallic weight the last tether to a world slipping into shadows and secrets. The castle's breath, once a rhythmic pulse of life and noise, now slowed into a solemn heartbeat. The pale woman with raven hair turned to face you, her eyes sharp, but softer now, touched by a quiet resolve that mirrored your own tangled mix of fear and hope. The map was safely tucked beneath her cloak, a relic of the revelations that had shifted the ground beneath every whispered word in these stone walls. Around you, the nobles exhaled collectively, the tension that had knotted their voices and stiffened their bearing beginning to unravel, just slightly, like the first tentative thaw in a long, merciless winter. The weight of unseen eyes had pressed down for hours, but now there was room for something new, the fragile beginning of trust, or at least necessity. Outside, the dawn stretched wider, golden and soft, bathing the castle's ancient facade with a light that felt like a benediction after a night of gathering storms. It seeped through the narrow windows, warming the cold stone just enough to remind you there was a morning beyond the shadowed halls. The stable boy, the once innocent witness to the court's dance of shadows, stepped forward, his eyes steady now, brimming with the quiet fire of resolve instead of naivete. He cast a glance in your direction, a silent pact passing between you. That laughter, even if fading, had once lit these corridors, and perhaps, in that light, seeds of renewal could still take root. The woman's voice broke the calm, low and steady as the old stones beneath your feet. The threats whispered in secrecy have been brought into light. The king's court must brace for change, but no longer behind veils or daggers in the dark. You felt the bells in your palm, once an emblem of hollow merriment, now transformed, an anchor holding you steady as the castle shifted from suspicion into the dawn of action. The fragile clink you made echoed lightly, not like a defeated sigh, but a cautious heartbeat. Something small, but deliberate in the silence. The nobles slowly began dispersing, their tight-knit groups loosening as faces once masked in scheming softened with the reality of shared danger. The air lightened around you, not with ease, but with the first spark of possibility. The castle had long been a cage of whispered plots and unseen knives, yet now it stirred with a tentative promise, a chance that even the darkest fortresses could find cracks for the light. Your gaze drifted to the hearth, where embers glowed faintly in the cool air. The fire, though still fragile, flickered steady, as if gathering its courage. The scent of smoldering wood mingled with stone and faint breath of fresh dawn. A quiet reminder that life perseveres beyond every shadowed night. You allowed yourself a rare moment to breathe fully, chest rising and falling like the slow tide of a calm sea. The heavy moat of worry in your gut began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious peace. The castle's game, for now, had shifted, no longer one of silent specters, but of voices ready to be heard, fragile alliances forming in the new light. The jester's cap perched awkwardly on your head no longer felt quite so heavy. The painted smile, once a thin mask, softened into something quieter, a memory of laughter's power, not to erase darkness, but to endure through it. As you turn toward the wide iron gates that led to the awakening world outside, the cold stone beneath your boots radiated a steady warmth, as if the fortress itself had breathed deeply and begun to settle. The scent of damp earth and early blooms whispered promises of renewal beyond the castle's ancient walls. Outside, the castle courtyard shimmered under the growing sun, the lingering mist catching golden light and turning into a soft, luminous veil. Footsteps echoed, not with dread now, but with tentative hope, a slow procession toward days where shadows and light might find balance. You cast a final glance backward, the flicker of shadows retreating, the noble silhouettes dissolving into embracing light. For the first time in long hours, the silence was not thick with menace, but with the calm that follows storm. The bells, now silent, rested lightly in your hand. Their quiet was not empty. It was filled with the lullaby of endings and beginnings intertwined. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling warmth into forgotten corners, you stepped forward, leaving behind the stone chambers and cold doubts. The laugh you once bore was a soft echo now, a guardian of memory, and a quiet song welcoming the dawn. The castle breathed with you, steady and patient, as peace finally settled. It was no triumph shouted, but a whispered harmony. And as your footsteps faded into light, the world outside waited, vast and unfolding, ready to cradle the slow turning of days. The game had ended, the night had passed, and in the tender blur of morning, all was well enough to rest